Barron Trump's bold moral challenge to Jasmine Crockett sparked national attention because it represented something that few expected from someone of his age and background. Barron has largely remained away from the center of political discourse, often seen only in glimpses at public events or alongside his family. For many Americans, he was more of a silent presence, rarely speaking out or making comments that stirred conversation. But when he raised a question about Jasmine Crockett's morals, it was as though a silent observer had suddenly taken the microphone. The question itself was sharp, thought-provoking, and carried a weight that instantly captured the attention of the media and the public. People were not only surprised at his willingness to confront a sitting member of Congress but also fascinated by how his question reflected a maturity that exceeded expectations. The impact of his words cannot be separated from the broader political climate in which this exchange occurred. America is already deeply polarized, with every statement from politicians examined, criticized, and often turned into a trending debate. When Barron stepped forward, it wasn't just another politician challenging another politician, it was the youngest member of the Trump family daring to question the moral compass of someone in power. This dynamic alone was enough to make people pause. Viewers began asking themselves whether this was simply a son defending his family's legacy or a young voice emerging with an independent perspective that needed to be considered on its own merits. His choice of words and the seriousness of his tone suggested that he was fully aware of the weight behind his question. As soon as the exchange happened, media outlets began dissecting it. Clips spread across social media platforms like wildfire, with people sharing their opinions in heated debates. Some praised Barron for his courage, calling him a young man who was unafraid to speak truth to power. Others criticized him, claiming that his involvement was orchestrated or that he had no business questioning an elected official. Regardless of which side one stood on, the fact remained that his question had ignited conversation far beyond the room where it was asked. It wasn't just about Barron or Crockett anymore, it had become a symbol of the larger cultural and political conflict playing out in America. Another layer to the attention his challenge received was the unusual reversal of roles. Normally, the expectation is that politicians will challenge younger people, offering guidance or correcting their views. In this case, it was the opposite. A young man who is still a student was questioning the moral authority of an experienced lawmaker. That reversal made the moment even more striking, as it highlighted a sense of accountability that many felt was missing from the political stage. People began discussing whether morality is truly being upheld by leaders or whether the younger generation might be the ones to demand higher standards. The tone Barron struck in his questioning also mattered. It wasn't framed as a casual comment or a playful jab, it carried a seriousness that suggested he had thought about what he wanted to say. The deliberate nature of his words made it clear that this was not a spur-of-the-moment outburst but a genuine concern about integrity and values. For the audience, this raised the stakes. If a young person like Barron could recognize gaps in morality among leaders, then what did that mean for the adults who were supposed to be setting examples? It was a subtle but powerful reminder that moral accountability does not depend on age or status. The aftermath of the question created waves not only in political circles but also among faith-based communities and family discussions across the country. Parents and educators pointed to the moment as an example of how even young voices should not be dismissed in debates about values. Many saw Barron's willingness to speak up as evidence that the younger generation is not only watching closely but also ready to engage in issues of morality and truth. The fact that his challenge went viral underscored how strongly society reacts when the themes of morality and politics intersect. At the same time, Jasmine Crockett's position as a lawmaker made the challenge even more significant. For someone in her role, being questioned on morals by someone like Barron was more than an uncomfortable moment, it was a spotlight shining directly on her character. Politicians are often criticized for their decisions, policies, or strategies, but being questioned on morality cuts to something much deeper. It demands a response not about political alignment but about the core of one's values. This is why so many people were eager to see how Crockett would respond, and why Barron's question lingered in people's minds even after the conversation ended. The boldness of Barron's act also sparked discussions about generational shifts. For decades, political families have been scrutinized, but children of politicians were typically sheltered from such confrontations. By stepping forward, Barron broke that mold. His willingness to engage directly showed that the line between the personal and political is thinner than many assume. It also highlighted how younger generations are no longer content to sit on the sidelines while adults dictate the moral tone of the nation. This resonated with young viewers who felt inspired by the idea that their voices, too, could carry weight in public discourse. The boldness of Barron's act also sparked discussions about generational shifts. For decades, political families have been scrutinized, but children of politicians were typically sheltered from such confrontations. By stepping forward, Barron broke that mold. His willingness to engage directly showed that the line between the personal and political is thinner than many assume. It also highlighted how younger generations are no longer content to sit on the sidelines while adults dictate the moral tone of the nation. This resonated with young viewers who felt inspired by the idea that their voices, too, could carry weight in public discourse. What makes this moment stand out even more is how it blurred the line between personal conviction and public spectacle. Barron was not simply repeating political talking points, he was questioning something fundamental about morality. That distinction made it harder for critics to dismiss him outright. Instead, it forced people to grapple with the question itself: what standards of morality do we expect from our leaders, and who has the right to ask them? In this way, Barron's challenge became more than just a single question directed at Jasmine Crockett. It became a mirror reflecting society's anxieties, expectations, and frustrations with the people in power. Crockett's unexpected Bible quote shifted the tone and left Barron momentarily speechless because it brought an element into the conversation that transcended politics and entered the realm of faith, tradition, and moral authority. In the middle of a tense exchange where Barron had pressed her about morals, Jasmine Crockett chose not to answer in the language of policy or partisan rhetoric but instead turned to Scripture. The Bible has always carried enormous symbolic weight in American discourse, often used to frame arguments around right and wrong, justice and hypocrisy. By invoking a passage in that moment, Crockett was not only responding to Barron but also signaling to the audience that her defense of morals was rooted in something greater than political opinion. That choice immediately shifted the atmosphere from a debate about personal integrity into a conversation tied to faith and its universal authority. The effect of her quoting Scripture was striking because it tapped into a deep cultural resonance. Whether or not one identifies as religious, the Bible has historically been regarded as a text that embodies moral lessons and higher truths. In political history, leaders who invoked Scripture often did so to strengthen their credibility, draw on shared values, and connect with the emotional core of the public. Crockett's move was in that same tradition, and the timing of her words carried an undeniable power. She was essentially saying that her morals were not self-defined or swayed by circumstance but aligned with an ancient authority that commanded respect. In that instant, she reframed the discussion in a way that left Barron struggling to counter with an equivalent measure of weight. The reason Barron was momentarily speechless was not necessarily because he lacked conviction but because the terrain of the conversation had suddenly shifted. He had framed his challenge in terms of personal accountability, questioning her integrity as an individual and a leader. When she responded with Scripture, she pulled the conversation out of the realm of individual perspective and into a framework of faith that has shaped generations. For someone like Barron, who was attempting to hold her accountable through a straightforward moral question, it became difficult to know how to respond without sounding dismissive of faith itself. To challenge her at that point would risk appearing as though he was questioning the Bible rather than her personal morals, which would have been a risky move in front of an audience deeply sensitive to faith. The audience reaction in that moment also contributed to why the shift felt so powerful. Many in attendance were caught off guard by her use of the Bible, but they immediately recognized the weight of it. Some nodded in approval, impressed that she could draw upon Scripture so quickly in her defense. Others were more skeptical, seeing her use of the Bible as a strategic deflection rather than a genuine expression of faith. Regardless of how it was interpreted, the fact remained that the quote silenced the young Trump momentarily, and that silence spoke volumes. Silence in debate is often louder than words because it signals reflection, hesitation, or an unexpected disruption in the speaker's rhythm. For Barron, who had delivered his question with confidence, this pause highlighted the unexpected power of her choice. The broader cultural resonance of this exchange is also significant. In America, the relationship between politics and religion is long and complicated. Leaders frequently invoke faith to bolster their credibility, and voters often evaluate moral integrity through a religious lens. Crockett's quote fit into this pattern, but it was especially impactful because of the context. She was not just quoting scripture in a prepared speech, she was doing it spontaneously in response to a direct challenge. That spontaneity gave her words a sense of authenticity that made them harder to dismiss. The audience, and eventually the millions watching online, saw the Bible being used not as a planned political prop but as a shield in the heat of confrontation. That image became part of why the moment went viral and why commentators dissected it for days afterward. Another important dimension is how Scripture itself operates rhetorically. Quoting the Bible is more than repeating words, it carries an implicit claim of higher moral ground. Crockett's use of Scripture suggested that she was not just defending her personal choices, but aligning herself with principles that have historically defined morality itself. It is difficult for any opponent, especially a young one like Barron, to counter without appearing irreverent or dismissive. In that sense, her move was not only unexpected but strategically powerful. She effectively placed herself on moral high ground, making any rebuttal fraught with potential backlash. At the same time, her decision to turn to Scripture was not without risk. Critics quickly pointed out that invoking the Bible in political debate can be seen as manipulative, a way of shielding oneself from accountability by appealing to authority that cannot be questioned. Some commentators argued that it was a calculated move designed to silence Barron rather than address the substance of his question. Yet even these criticisms underscored the impact of her words. If the moment had been insignificant, it would not have sparked such intense debate about authenticity, sincerity, and the role of faith in politics. The fact that Barron was left momentarily speechless also highlighted the generational contrast between the two. He had approached the exchange with the directness of youth, challenging her on moral grounds with the expectation that she would respond in kind. Crockett, as a seasoned politician, responded with a rhetorical tool that transcended his frame of reference. That generational clash illustrated the difference between straightforward moral questioning and the layered strategies of political defense. It revealed how political figures often rely on symbolic authority to maintain control of the conversation, while younger voices may expect answers rooted in simple honesty. This contrast made the moment memorable and raised questions about how future generations will navigate debates that mix politics with religion. The silence that followed her Bible quote also became symbolic in itself. Viewers interpreted it in different ways. Some saw it as a sign of Barron's respect for faith, others as evidence that he had been strategically outmaneuvered. What united these interpretations was the recognition that a shift had occurred. The Bible had entered the debate, and once it did, the rules changed. That shift transformed the moment into something larger than an exchange between two individuals. It became a snapshot of the enduring power of Scripture in American life, capable of halting debate, redefining arguments, and leaving even confident challengers unsure of how to proceed. Her unexpected Bible quote not only disrupted the flow of the debate but also framed the discussion in terms that demanded broader reflection. It forced the audience to consider how morality is defined and defended, whether through personal conviction, political rhetoric, or religious authority. It left lingering questions about whether faith should be invoked in defense of one's morals and what it means for a political leader to turn to Scripture when challenged. In that moment, Jasmine Crockett shifted the spotlight away from Barron's boldness and onto the enduring role of the Bible as a source of moral grounding in a fractured political landscape. The exchange highlighted deeper debates on faith, values, and political integrity because it brought to the surface questions that extend beyond a single confrontation between Barron Trump and Jasmine Crockett. When Barron asked his moral question and Crockett responded with a Bible quote, the moment became symbolic of the tensions that have long existed in American public life about how personal faith intersects with political responsibility. Politics is not just about laws and governance but also about the standards of conduct and principles that leaders are expected to uphold. For decades, Americans have debated whether leaders should be judged more by their political effectiveness or by their moral character. This single exchange reignited that debate, reminding the public that the questions of morality and integrity remain as pressing as ever. Faith plays a unique role in these discussions because it is deeply personal and yet often invoked in public contexts. When Crockett chose to use Scripture to respond to Barron, she was asserting that her values were anchored in something beyond political expediency. This raised questions about how genuine such claims are when made in the heat of debate. Some observers praised her for grounding her response in faith, seeing it as a sign of sincerity and conviction. Others questioned whether her use of the Bible was more about optics than truth, suggesting that faith should not be wielded as a rhetorical weapon. These differing perspectives reflect a broader national struggle. Should religious faith be seen as evidence of moral authority in politics, or should political leaders be judged independently of their spiritual expressions? The exchange also sparked discussions about values, both personal and societal. Barron's question challenged Crockett to account for her morals, but it also indirectly asked the audience to reflect on what values they expect from their leaders. Integrity, honesty, accountability, and consistency are often spoken of as essential values, but the reality is that political life frequently puts them to the test. Crockett's defense suggested that her values were tied to Scripture, while Barron's challenge implied skepticism about whether her actions matched such claims. This tension between declared values and lived reality is at the heart of many political debates, and the moment made that tension impossible to ignore. Political integrity became another central theme because of the nature of the confrontation. Integrity in politics is often defined by whether leaders remain true to their stated principles, keep their promises, and act with transparency. When Barron questioned Crockett's morals, he was essentially raising the issue of whether she demonstrated integrity in her role as a leader. Her Bible quote could be interpreted as an assertion of integrity, aligning her actions with a higher moral framework, or it could be seen as a way of avoiding a direct answer. Either interpretation points to the larger problem of how integrity is judged in politics. Is it measured by words and symbolic gestures, or by concrete actions that reflect one's commitments? The debate that followed the exchange showed just how divided the public is on these questions. Supporters of Crockett argued that quoting Scripture was an appropriate and powerful way to respond, showing that she stood firm in her beliefs. Critics argued that she sidestepped accountability, using faith as a shield to deflect scrutiny. This polarization mirrors the broader divisions in American society, where debates about morality and politics often break down along ideological lines. What some see as strength and conviction, others see as manipulation and deflection. The confrontation between Barron and Crockett became a microcosm of these larger cultural battles, with both sides claiming the moral high ground. Faith in politics is not new, but the exchange underscored how complex it has become in modern times. The United States has a long history of leaders invoking religion, from Abraham Lincoln to Martin Luther King Jr. to modern presidents. Each time, the intent has been to draw on shared values to inspire unity or justify action. But in a deeply divided era, such invocations often spark skepticism rather than unity. Crockett's Bible quote reminded the public of this tension. While some connected with her words, others saw them as another example of how politicians use faith strategically rather than authentically. This skepticism highlights how fragile the connection between faith and political credibility has become. Another reason the exchange resonated so deeply is that it involved a generational contrast. Barron, as a member of the younger generation, represents fresh eyes on the political system and a willingness to ask blunt, unfiltered questions. Crockett, as an established lawmaker, responded with the tools and strategies that come with experience. This clash highlighted the values gap between younger Americans who demand straightforward answers and older leaders who often respond with layered rhetoric. The younger generation's growing insistence on authenticity and accountability raises the question of whether traditional political tactics, like quoting scripture in defense, will continue to hold sway or whether they will be increasingly dismissed as evasions. The integrity debate also extends beyond Crockett herself and touches on the expectations of the public. Citizens often express frustration with hypocrisy in politics, criticizing leaders who preach values but fail to live by them. Barron's question tapped directly into this frustration, voicing a sentiment that many Americans feel: leaders should be held accountable not only for their policies but also for their moral example. Crockett's response, while powerful in its delivery, highlighted the difficulty of meeting this demand. It showed how easily moral debates in politics can turn into performances rather than genuine engagements with the truth. The lasting significance of this exchange lies in how it revealed the fragile balance between faith, values, and integrity in the political arena. It demonstrated that faith can still silence a critic, at least momentarily, but it also showed how such moments quickly become contested battlegrounds where motives and sincerity are questioned. It highlighted how values are constantly tested in public life and how integrity remains the elusive standard that leaders are measured against. Most of all, it reminded the nation that debates about morality in politics are never just about the individuals involved but about the broader struggle over what kind of leadership Americans truly want.